The mansion stood still in the silence of the night. A dim light flickered inside the master bedroom, where she sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers gripping the silky fabric of her wedding dress. It felt heavier than it should, perhaps because of the weight of the situation she had trapped herself in. Across the room, he stood by the window, his hands tucked into his pockets. His suit jacket was tossed carelessly onto the chair, and his tie hung loose around his neck. He had barely spoken since they arrived. There was no need to. They both knew what this was: a contract, a mere arrangement. She exhaled softly and glanced at him. "I'll take the couch," she muttered, standing up. His gaze shifted to her, but he didn't argue. Instead, he leaned against the window pane, watching the city lights beyond. "Suit yourself," he replied, his tone indifferent. She picked up a blanket and made her way to the couch near the fireplace. The air was thick with an unspoken tension. Neither hostility nor warmth, just an unfamiliar distance between two people forced under the same roof. Minutes passed, perhaps hours. The crackling of the fireplace was the only sound breaking the silence. She shifted under the blanket, feeling the discomfort of the situation settle deep in her chest. This wasn't how she had imagined marriage. Then again, this wasn't really a marriage, was it? Just before she closed her eyes, she heard him speak, quiet, almost hesitant. "This doesn't have to be difficult," he said, still looking out the window. She didn't reply. Maybe he was right. Or maybe it was already far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. And so the first night of their contract marriage passed, under the same roof, yet miles apart. A marriage is usually built on love, trust, and shared dreams. But for them, it was nothing more than a carefully drafted agreement. Words written on paper that defined their relationship, setting boundaries, expectations, and, most importantly, an expiration date. Two individuals, once strangers, now found themselves tied together by legal formalities. The reasons that led them to this arrangement were different, yet neither could back out. Whether it was family pressure, financial obligations, or personal motives, they had both willingly signed their names on the contract, knowing that emotions had no place in this marriage. From the outside, the world would see them as the perfect couple, flawlessly dressed for the wedding, exchanging vows before an audience that had no idea about the truth. Smiles were practiced, gestures carefully controlled, and every word spoken was rehearsed like lines from a script. To everyone else, it was a dream wedding, a union to be celebrated, but beneath the surface, the two were merely playing their roles, ensuring that the illusion of a real marriage remained. Now, standing under the same roof as husband and wife, reality began to set in. The grandeur of the wedding ceremony had faded, and what remained was an unfamiliar silence between them. Despite wearing rings that signified their supposed bond, they were nothing more than two people forced into a commitment that neither truly desired. She had her reasons. Maybe it was to protect someone she loved, to escape an unavoidable fate, or to secure something she couldn't have otherwise. He had his own justifications, perhaps an obligation to uphold, a deal he couldn't refuse, or a situation that left him with no choice. Whatever had brought them here didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that they were in this together, bound by a contract that dictated the course of their lives from this moment forward. The house they stepped into was unfamiliar, yet it would be their shared space for as long as the contract remained in effect. Every detail had been planned. Separate rooms, defined responsibilities, and a list of rules that neither was allowed to break. It was a carefully constructed arrangement designed to ensure that emotions never got in the way. There were no heartfelt conversations, no eager touches, no nervous excitement that usually accompanied the first night of marriage. Instead, there was distance, an unspoken understanding that each would stay in their own space, keeping their lives separate despite sharing a surname. Their names were written together on the marriage certificate, but that was the only thing tying them to each other. There were no shared memories, no moments of affection, no whispered promises of forever. The contract dictated their relationship, how they would present themselves to the world, what they were expected to do, and most importantly, when it would all come to an end. Everything had been planned, every detail accounted for, but what the contract didn't mention were the unforeseen moments, the unpredictable changes, and the emotions that neither had intended to feel. The first night of marriage is often filled with warmth, excitement, and tender moments between two people stepping into a new phase of life together. But for them, it was different. The air was thick with tension, an unspoken discomfort hanging between them like an invisible wall. They had entered this marriage not out of love, but out of necessity, an agreement bound by terms, conditions, and the awareness that this was never meant to be real. The large bedroom, adorned with elegant decorations and soft candlelight, felt like a mockery of their reality. Rose petals were scattered on the silk sheets of the bed, a sign of romance that neither of them acknowledged. The faint scent of flowers and warm vanilla filled the air, a contrast to the coldness that settled between them. Everything had been arranged to reflect a perfect wedding night, yet there was nothing perfect about it. She sat at the edge of the bed, hands clasped together as she stared at the floor. The dress she wore felt heavier than before, as if the weight of the day had finally settled on her shoulders. Across the room, he stood near the window, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the dark cityscape beyond. Neither spoke, neither moved. It was as though they were waiting for the other to break the silence, waiting for the night to pass, waiting for this whole situation to feel less strange. The sound of the clock ticking echoed through the silence, each second stretching endlessly. The atmosphere was suffocating, filled with an awkwardness that neither had prepared for. They had discussed the terms of this arrangement beforehand. They knew what was expected, what was required, and what was strictly off limits. And yet, now that they were here, under the same roof, in the same space, it felt much harder than they had anticipated. She cleared her throat lightly, attempting to ease the tension, but the effort felt meaningless. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge her presence beyond what was necessary. It wasn't rudeness, just indifference. This was simply another obligation to fulfill, another responsibility to handle. There was no reason to make it more complicated than it already was. The room felt too big, the silence too loud. Every small movement seemed amplified. The rustling of fabric, the creak of the floorboards, the faint sound of breathing. Even though they were feet apart, the distance between them felt much greater. The weight of unspoken words, unexpressed thoughts, and suppressed emotions made the atmosphere heavier with each passing moment. She shifted slightly, feeling the strain of exhaustion creeping in. The day had been long, filled with formalities and expectations, smiling for the guests, exchanging vows that held no meaning, pretending to be something they were not. It had taken its toll. Now, with no audience watching, no cameras capturing their every move, the reality of their situation was undeniable. He finally moved, walking towards the chair in the corner of the room. He loosened his tie, exhaling as he sat down. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, a fleeting glance that held no warmth, no hostility, just quiet understanding. They were both trapped in the same situation, both trying to navigate an unfamiliar reality. Silence had settled between them, heavy yet fragile, as if a single word could shatter whatever thin understanding they had. The air in the room was tense, not with hostility, but with something far more complex, an emotion neither of them wanted to acknowledge. They were strangers, bound by a contract, their lives intertwined not by choice, but by necessity. And yet, despite the logical boundaries set in place, there was something beneath the surface, something neither of them dared to name. She sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap, fingers lightly tracing the embroidered fabric of her dress. The day had exhausted her, not physically, but emotionally. Every smile, every congratulatory handshake, every whispered remark about the beautiful couple had chipped away at the wall she had tried to build around herself. Now, in the quiet of their shared space, she felt raw, exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the setting or the occasion. He, on the other hand, was unreadable. His expression was calm, detached even, but there was something in his gaze, something guarded. He had played his role well, standing beside her at the altar, exchanging vows with the practiced ease of someone who had long since learned how to conceal what he truly felt. But now, with no one watching, no obligations demanding his attention, he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. They had spoken about this before, about the rules, the limitations, the fact that this was nothing more than a business arrangement. And yet, the reality of sitting across from each other alone for the first time as husband and wife was different from what either of them had anticipated. The silence was not just awkward, it was filled with the weight of unspoken emotions, of thoughts neither of them wanted to voice. She wondered what he was thinking. Did he regret this? Did he feel trapped the way she did? Or was this just another calculated decision for him, one that held no real consequence beyond its contractual obligations? He observed her from the corner of his eye, noting the way she avoided looking directly at him. Was she uncomfortable, angry, sad? He couldn't tell. And for some reason, the fact that he couldn't read her bothered him. He had assumed this would be simple, that their emotions wouldn't factor into the equation, but now, sitting in the same space, forced into an intimacy that was anything but real, he found himself questioning everything he had believed about this arrangement. Neither of them spoke, but the silence was not empty. It was filled with the weight of everything they wouldn't say, the doubts, the uncertainty, the quiet realization that no matter how much they wanted to treat this as just another obligation, something about this night had already begun to blur the lines. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The tension between them had not lessened, nor had the silence been broken by unnecessary words. It wasn't an awkward pause waiting to be filled. It was an understanding, an unspoken agreement that neither of them wanted to address out loud. They had gone over the rules before. Their marriage was not built on love or companionship, but on necessity. It was a contract, clear in its terms, precise in its conditions. There would be no expectations beyond what had been agreed upon, no unnecessary interactions, and certainly no emotional entanglements. They would present themselves as a perfect couple in front of the world, play their parts convincingly, but behind closed doors, they would remain two separate individuals leading separate lives. And yet, as they stood in the same room on the first night of their marriage, the reality of those words felt heavier than they had imagined. She inhaled slowly, standing near the dresser, her fingers grazing the edge of a decorative box as if grounding herself. The idea of sharing a space with someone she barely knew, someone she was now bound to by law, was unsettling. Even with all the terms laid out, there was an undeniable awareness of his presence, a quiet understanding that this was now her life, whether she liked it or not. He leaned against the armchair near the window, his posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp, as if assessing the situation carefully. He had no desire to make this night more complicated than it needed to be. This arrangement was transactional, and he had no intention of making it anything more. Still, he recognized that this moment, this very first night, set the foundation for whatever their future would look like. Neither of them wanted unnecessary conflict, and neither of them wanted to pretend in private. So, without words, they had already decided there would be rules. She turned slightly, looking at him for the first time in what felt like hours. "I'll sleep on the couch," she said, her voice steady but lacking warmth. It was a statement, not a request. He studied her for a moment before nodding. "Do whatever makes you comfortable," he replied, his tone equally neutral. He had no intention of forcing anything, and if she needed space, he would give it. That was it. No arguments, no insistence on sharing the bed, no unnecessary conversation about how to navigate this situation. They understood each other, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. She gathered a blanket and settled onto the couch without another word. He remained by the window for a moment longer before turning off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The silence stretched between them, but this time it was not suffocating. It was simply there, a quiet agreement between two people who had just taken their first step into a life neither of them had planned. The night had stretched long, wrapped in silence that neither of them had dared to break. The rules had been set, the boundaries drawn, and an unspoken understanding had settled between them. They were not here for love, companionship, or even friendship, just two strangers fulfilling an obligation. But sometimes, despite the best efforts to maintain control, emotions found a way to slip through the cracks. She had curled up on the couch, wrapped in a thin blanket that did little to shield her from the cold. It wasn't just the temperature, there was a certain loneliness in the air, one that no amount of logic could suppress. Sleep refused to come, her mind restless, her body tense from the unfamiliar surroundings. This wasn't her home. This wasn't her life, and yet she was here, tied to someone she barely knew. On the other side of the room, he sat in the dim glow of the city lights streaming through the window. He had noticed the way she shifted, adjusting herself every few minutes, as if trying to find a comfort that would never come. He wasn't sure why he kept watching. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe it was something else. Something he didn't want to admit. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "You won't be able to sleep like that." She stiffened slightly, surprised that he had even acknowledged her discomfort. For a moment, she debated ignoring him, pretending she hadn't heard, but exhaustion won over pride, and she exhaled softly. "I'll manage." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't the type to care about things that didn't concern him, but something about the way she hugged the blanket around herself, as if she were trying to disappear, made him feel unsettled. Without a word, he stood, walked to the closet, and pulled out a thicker blanket. He tossed it onto the couch beside her, his voice neutral as he said, "Use this." She blinked, looking up at him in surprise. It wasn't much, just a simple gesture, but it caught her off guard. This was a man who had kept his distance all night, who had barely acknowledged her presence beyond what was necessary. And yet, in this moment, he had offered something. She hesitated before murmuring, "Thank you." But he didn't respond, simply turning back toward his own space, as if dismissing the moment entirely. But she knew he had noticed. He had seen the wariness in her eyes, the quiet struggle she had tried to hide, and in that brief exchange, the walls between them shifted. Just slightly, just enough to make her wonder. The silence returned, but this time, it didn't feel as suffocating. It was different now, carrying with it something neither of them could quite name,